Do 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 do. Extras.
A lot of odds and ends for this extras, so starting with a bunch of little notes. The fact that I let Little One learn his new maneuver without resting was a little weird in hindsight. My logic was that he likely learns as much through fighting as anything else, and he can change his readied maneuvers in like 5 minutes, whereas spells need to be memorized, taking 8 hours rest, etc. But clearly it's kind of a pointless distinction. Many games don't let heroes level up outside of town. I think it depends on the campaign, and here they won't necessarily get that downtime. But whatever the rule, it should be fair, so I should have at least made him wait until everyone else could rest and get the benefits of their levels as well. Just a nitpick, though. There was actually more discussion of Angel gathering chemicals for poisons, which, like so many things, I cut for time and flow reasons. Angel actually used Mage Hand to collect some samples for research purposes, for her and for Draven. But then they began to worry about what to keep the samples in. Metal versus glass vials. Many of the pools were thought to be acidic, and acids can eat through metals. Without knowing the exact chemistry, it's hard to say what might or might not be safe. But glass is fragile. You don't want them breaking during a fight, or getting jostled in a portable hole while sifting through for some other item. And knowing there might be mixing of chemicals and possibly magic stuff, it's even possible there might be glass-eating acids. After going round and round with increasingly paranoid solutions, they settled on putting samples in glass vials, and then Draven casts Major Creation to encase them all in stone. As Draven noted, they last 14 hours, but at that point we'll set it aside and watch from a safe distance as the stone fades away to see if the vials are still intact. If there's no sign of corrosion, chances are they're glass safe. When Draven finally asked who or what Rygax was talking to, it was so long since the concept had been introduced, only 3 or 4 sessions, but like months of real time, that I couldn't even find the notes from long ago. I knew everything about them, except that I couldn't remember the name, so I gave up and literally called them midichlorians for the rest of the session, much to everyone's annoyance. And as for why 2 fingers, although they are microscopic, it would take a certain minimum amount of them to form a healthy colony, and he was worried that if they were concentrated in a single finger, he might notice some loss of flexibility. By spreading his portable mini-colony between 2 fingers, he minimized the impact. As for what the Mezzania get out of the deal, at the base level, this mobile colony has opportunities to gather and share more diverse information with their brethren. But the Mezzania, though we may see them as simple, do have some sort of collective consciousness, or maybe that isn't the right word, but there is something to them beyond simple survival. And at some fundamental level, these ones, this group who joined Rygax, believe that helping him ultimately serves the greater good. So when the players saw Kaiser, Black and Little One both wanted to attack instantly after his hello, without letting him get another word in. This was problematic, because he had a bunch of good dialogue, and I felt the encounter would suffer without some of it. It would become just another contextless fight. Remember, the bad guy vision segments I show in TDDC are information the players never saw, so this is just some rando off the street to them. So my compromise was that he got out a fair bit of monologuing, but they still got to interrupt him at some point, still before he would have finished, and before he got to the duel offer. When Black says, "I know he's evil, right?" that's when they wanted to attack, and Black said it marginally first, which is why I let him get in the first blow, or at least the first try. Now, Kaiser should have been a melee powerhouse, but when I built him, mostly like a normal character, I didn't inflate his hit points to compensate for the party's power level. I was still trying to reserve that for specific things which are supposed to be exceptional threats, mainly Deathfin monitors, Vampire Kings, and old dragons. Although I hadn't read the article by the Angry GM about making compelling bosses, an article I frequently recommend to people on the Discord, I had accidentally almost come up with the same thing, because once Victor, the red outline, joined with him, filling in his missing eye and arm with his red glow, he was going to gain a second initiative pass. Effectively, he would get 2 whole turns every round. He could move an attack on either or both. If he had enemies in front of him, Kaiser could full attack, and then Victor could full attack again in the same round, using his Ghost Touch blade, or whatever else they do. And I figured this meant I had to treat him as two creatures for XP and challenge rating. But I hadn't thought it through in detail the way Angry GM had, so I didn't realize that he should also have twice the hit points, and some other tweaks Angry's article suggests. Of course, if I had been really on the ball with some quick thinking, the obvious solution to him getting beat down too fast, as he was, would have been to have him full healed when Victor showed up to join with him. It would have felt legitimate, clearly would have made a better fight, because they likely wouldn't do 240 damage again so quickly the second time, and, as mentioned, in hindsight, he should have had double the HP anyway for his challenge rating. Also, I'm not giving his full stats now, because I may not be done with him, but I will say he had levels in a prestige class from Tome of Battle, the same book with Little One's Warblade and Angel Sword Sage classes. It's called Eternal Blade, an elven PRC where the wielder benefits from the wisdom of an ancient master, a spiritual advisor of sorts, which follows them around. Of course, with Vampire Kings and Shackles and such, Kaiser's spirit guide, Victor, works a little differently. But that's at least the source of some of his abilities and a big inspiration for the pair. At Sildari's suggestion, I went with the sneakier title A-OK, instead of the perfect except too spoilery title I was thinking of, Attack on Krillidin. Obviously after the anime Attack on Titan, AOT, whose titans and even music I was clearly trying to evoke in the latter part of this episode. I clearly hadn't fully thought through the implications of starting them so far away with a skilled archer that the party could buff to insanity and engage this all-melee force at extreme range. I got a little tension, but it turned into this whole different thing, as you observed, and now if Large Force, TM, gets a spin-off, it'll have to be a prequel. Provide their stats here. I'm not going to go through every detail of them. I mean, you can pause and take a look, but we had Floppy, the giant zombie giant, 215 hit points. His slam had an improved grapple, and he could swallow whole for maximum attack on Titanness. People would have to fight their way out of the inside, being crushed and negative energy damaged, and all that good stuff. And we had Luke Sidewalker, the giant gargantuan zombie giant, with 299 hit points, which is actually a lot more toughness than that if you factor in the gargantuan DR. Instead of the swallowing power, because he's using his arms to move and stuff like that, didn't make as much sense, he had a trample, which did 4d6 plus 44 damage. And because the reflex save is based on strength, and he's bloody gargantuan, dodging his trample is virtually impossible. Even Angel's not gonna reliably hit DC 46 on a reflex save. I mean, they would get to take an attack of opportunity as he passed, and they would probably hit his terrible armor class, but he would have run over them for a pretty significant chunk of damage. And finally, Mr. Skullhead, our giant Death Knight, which is just glorious, just that's his description. He only had 199 hit points, he had a slightly higher armor class, not a lot. His damage reduction was bludgeoning instead of slashing, because of course the Death Knights in my game are skeletons. He could full attack for a fair chunk of damage had he ever actually gotten into melee, and his Spellblade powers gave him the ability to quick cast haste, as we saw, but also gave him the ability to add even more damage to his standard action attacks by adding spells, including Raven Feeblement, which is pretty rough, Shocking Grasp for just like a pile of damage, and he had a bunch of other maneuverability options and stuff, but nothing that actually would help him get to the party faster other than the haste itself. I'm going to leave their gear to be identified in the next video, and as you can see, it was a total of 713 hit points worth of gigantic undead bearing down on them, and with their various forms of damage reduction, the actual gross damage Krillidin had to deal was easily over 1,000. And while the Death Knight's Bone Wall ability feels like it could have protected him from some of those arrows, I felt that if he moved, then dropped a wall in front of him, and Krill shot it to pieces, the DK would have to get through the difficult terrain it left behind, slowing it down and potentially costing it another whole round of withering fire. We catch a glimpse of Cornello in this bad guy vision post-credit scene with a ton of confusing exposition about what his forces are up to. I'm not going to spoil your fun speculation about all that. But more fundamentally, what's the deal with Cornello, and why does he, as one YouTube comment put it, spend his unlife lovingly stroking a giant portrait of Dracula from Castlevania? Let's rewind a bit. A very long time ago, in a tale I won't tell here, the four kings, all vampires, gained the power to shackle spirits. With this new strength, they rose and conquered the main continent of the Shadowfell and destroyed all other vampires. They each established a kingdom, becoming known as the East King, the North King, the West King, and the South King, respectively. Their grand task complete, their truce fell apart, as each sought to capture more shackles, more power from the others. Then one of them, Swain, the West King, committed the great error. Not only did he create a new vampire, Alyssa, the fifth, but somehow she learned to create spirit shackles of her own, seizing a portion of his lands and of the lands of his fellow kings, where she established her own power base and nation between them all. Through many more centuries, they all fought for control, making and breaking various alliances with other powers in the Shadowfell, each experimenting with the spirit shackles they could not themselves use to create the powerful but subservient beings known as their lieutenants. It was all a giant mess, but they had learned one thing. To create another vampire was the worst kind of folly, and each swore to themselves they would never make such an error. Or in Swain's case, never again. But vampires, those who survive through the centuries, can be complex creatures, beings of tremendous power but frustrated by stalemate, of tremendous knowledge and boredom, of fiery passions tempered by or battling against the cold calculus of age and immortality, the detachment derived from witnessing countless deaths, deaths by their own hands, but also deaths against their wishes. Part of the curse of the vampire is that most of their internal organs wither and die, save only the heart, which depends on the blood of others, and a mind trapped within their cursed flesh. For all these reasons and more, they are said to be hollow of both body and spirit. Have they known countless loves, only to watch each one die? Or have they never loved, taking only playthings to pass the time? For love seems antithetical to their endless, predatory existence. Countless creatures and many spirits are oppressed by the rule of the vampire kings, and rarely do they have any hope to rise up against their monstrous overlords. But a couple centuries ago, after many decades of preparation, such an army did rise up against the North King, Vladimir the Cold. Led and, in part, inspired by Gygax, the renowned servant of Anku, shepherd of the dead, the rebellion rose up and assaulted many of the North King's shackles simultaneously all around his realm. Though Vladimir himself responded fairly quickly, he could only personally defeat a few of the many attacks before he lost several abilities that both he and Gygax considered critical to him. With all he had built seemingly collapsing around him, he retreated to his great stronghold, Poenari's citadel, where his remaining enemies converged for the final siege. Those who could die, died. Those who could not, immortal spirits, were broken, banished to the astral sea, a shadow of themselves. The losses were massive, heartrending, but as the strongest and luckiest of them continued fighting, taking on the king in person, Gygax revealed his true power, and they somehow prevailed, striking Vladimir down. And Gygax plunged a blessed stake, a sharpened wooden dowel engraved with many runes, through the vampire's heart, stopping his regeneration and destroying him utterly. Gygax and the other leaders had planned for failure, but they had also planned for success, for hope. To avoid simply strengthening one or more of the other kings, they had arranged for weaker and more subtle allies to move the unshackled, those who could be moved, and to hide those spirits away. For those shackles whose spirits could not simply move, allies with particular powers were positioned to guard them. Some of these allies were spirits whose great power would have been desperately needed in the final assault, and yet, to ensure that the victory meant anything, all participants had risked leaving them behind, risked confronting Vladimir without this strength, on the hope that they could yet prevail, and that these particular shrines might be defended from Swain, Alyssa, and Lockhart. These leaders, the wise, the old, and the clever, spirits, elves, and Gygax, had planned for almost everything. What they had failed to plan for, failed to predict, was love. Those who thought they knew the power and complexity of the vampires so well failed to anticipate that Vladimir the Cold would do the one thing each of the kings had sworn never to do. Decades earlier, Vladimir had taken a lover, a half-giant who bore the blood of frost giants who had fled to the Shadowfell, driven from their northern homelands by the sons of Smith. Perhaps the vampire thought of this large young man as simply another handsome plaything. Perhaps he was meant to be food. Certainly, Vlad never imagined committing the great error. But their relationship grew to a strong friendship, a partnership, a love. And yet, as grew their love, so did time chip away at young Cornello. Initially, Vladimir thought nothing of it. It is the way of mortals. Even the beloved live and age and die, like pets, to be mourned by the immortals, carried forward in their memories. But as Cornello continued to grow older, losing his hair, and his knees beginning to grow weak, as is common for mismatched half-breeds such as himself, Vladimir was overcome with sadness. Surely the young man had decades of life left. Never before had the king been struck by mourning for a pet which was still healthy and very much alive. But as he imagined his friend, his lover, growing weaker by the day, he fell into grave depression, and, in the way of powerful, immortal creatures, he began thinking, scheming, of ways to keep what he had. He could throw away one of his lieutenants, give those powers to Cornello, but he would prefer not to enslave his friend in such a callous manner, nor to burden him with an immortal life of discomfort as a skeletal being or an incorporeal one, unable to feel. The spring would be ideal, if that was the only way. Better he live as a Deathmore than as a Wendigo or a Voivoda. But Oluwana would not be ready for some 40 years. The man may die by then, or would at best be old and frail, frozen in that state for time eternal. And so, after much deliberation, the soul-searching of the soulless, he had done it. Vladimir, despite having sworn to himself never to do so, never to repeat Swain's mistake, turned this mortal. Vlad turned his lover, making Cornello a vampire in his own right. Any weakness was banished from him, and though he would forever look his last mortal age, in his 40s and center bald, he was free from death and free-willed, though cursed to the eternal hunger which they two now shared. Thus, when the assaults had begun, Vladimir had sent his friend away, banished to safety, for Cornello had less than a fraction of the ancient king's strength. But when Vlad's heart was pierced, when his body was burned and his ashes scattered, his assailants were as ignorant as they were victorious. For not only did another vampire still lurk in the cold north, but Vladimir and Cornello had shared everything. Vlad had even repeated Swain's greatest and most unimaginable folly. He had taught his apprentice how to shackle spirits. Though Cornello had only one shackle of his own, it was one of those Vladimir had protected, and after the king's destruction, none knew that its power might still be in use. And he knew their territory well. Before the broken and battered vampire slayers knew what was happening, he had reclaimed a small and growing segment of Vladimir's former shackles and set about avenging his love. The greatest remaining free spirits were still struggling to guard shrines against the might of the other vampire kings, and Rygax and those who had survived Pornari's sanctum were exhausted, drained. They could do nothing, as all their work, as all that their friends had sacrificed for, was so swiftly erased. The dead mountains, so newly and briefly freed, were recaptured from within. It was a mess, and Cornello was never able to reclaim some of what had belonged to his friend, his sire, his lover. But at the beginning of the rebellion, 5 kings had stood, and at the end of the whole tragic affair, still stood 5 vampire kings. His vengeance largely complete, Cornello found that along with these powers and these servants, he had inherited all Vladimir's struggles, his troubles, and worse, it was now his turn to grieve for the man he had lost.
Trantos01 asked, "Is Cornello still unaware of all the party's recent shenanigans? The giant zombies and Death Knight aren't exactly subtle. Where are Cornello's border defenses?"
They may have broken through some defenses farther west that we didn't see, and it's possible that Cornello had a lot of forces tied up in Wendigo's foray, wherever that worm shrine is, but it's very unlikely that his scouts would not be aware of the massive zombies storming down on his side of the border and kicking up floor-to-ceiling dust. Bigrin asked,
"How sensitive are your vampire kings to
Again, what little information scholars have on this is based more on other vampires who once existed. There's not a lot of evidence of the kings getting a tan. B. de Worst asked,
What was the inspiration for the spirit shackles? Was it the sorcerer kings and queens of Dark Sun, and the way they could grant spells to their Templars?
My knowledge of Dark Sun is very surface level, so it had nothing to do with that. Pretty much all creativity is combining elements inspired from somewhere, but I can't really point to anywhere the spirit shackles specifically came from. It's more that I wanted both the Feywild and the Shadowfell to be much more alive and full of spirits than the Fadelands. But where spirits in the Feywild should be wild and free, everything in a Shadowfell tends toward the hidden, the coercive, and the parasitic. Having the plane, or at least this continent, dominated by unshakable powers who bind and enslave spirits helps create that feel. The Vampire Kings are both physical, blood, and spiritual parasites, and that in turn forces spirits to be furtive and try to remain hidden, while others survive by stealing or draining strength from mortals, from the undead, and from each other. William Bailey asked,
Is there any way to break a spirit shackle and then take the freed spirit to one of the other planes? To take them forever beyond the vampire's reach? Even if there was an insanely costly ritual or something involved, it seems it would be worth it.
Some spirits are mobile, some are not. Some can go to other planes, like that fox spirit we met outside Draven's estate, or like Thunder the Aardvark, who, after being freed from the stained glass shackle, ran up to the maze, what was once the Garden of Three Worlds, and used brute force pathfinding to find their way back to the Feywild. But many other spirits cannot or will not leave their home location or home plane. Again, spirits are all very different from one another. Hyde Lawless asked, "Do all the kings feed the way Swain does, by breeding humans or whatever, like livestock? And do vampires have to feed on their own kind's blood? Like, would Cornello have to drink the blood of giants or half-giants? Or can he just feed on any old blood?" Vampires can survive by drinking from nearly anything with blood. Animals are barely sustenance, though. There's something about the blood of sentience that helps the vampires grow stronger. It's a very gradual process, but they do have the time. It's also unclear whether they gain more benefit from killing than from non-lethally milking their prey for blood. If not, if draining prey without killing them provided the same benefit, that would make Swain and the others just that little bit more monstrous. As far as humanoid ranching, it's pretty popular, but other vampire kings have different arrangements, or have at various points in their history. For example, Lockhart, who has the huge territory taking up most of the east of the continent, has a number of functional nations that he has subjugated. They are each blessed with the ability to govern themselves in most ways, but they are also faced with the horrifying duty of selecting and sending him sacrifices, which means he doesn't need minions to directly raise his feeding stock. They take care of themselves. Alexander Bergerstetter asked, "Have you ever been in an RPG group you didn't like?" There was one group in a gaming shop in university that was kind of meh. The setting and the GM style kind of rubbed me the wrong way. But even the group from the old D&D excerpts, I'll get them back up someday, that group became bizarrely adversarial, like almost as adversarial between players and GM as another gaming comic often is. But somehow, I think most of us were having a lot of fun, most of the time. It was a dynamic which would be very hard to reproduce. Dimon asked,
"Immortality seems to be difficult to achieve in your setting. If even the ageless Warforged would die due to their components failing, would there have been a way to make Cornello immortal without a spirit shackle or the curse of undeath? Also, was immortality a goal for any of the player characters, or were they just interested because it was dangled in front of them?"
I would think immortality should be fairly hard to achieve in most settings, though horrible ways like becoming undead tend to be somewhat easier. A lot of the various lieutenants of the Vampire Kings do become immortal, most often by becoming undead, and that is probably one of the big selling your soul temptations that leads individuals to accept utter servitude. But if there was a better way available to Vlad, he probably would have thought of one. What little we've heard so far makes the Oluwana Spring sound like maybe it's a good deal? I don't think any of the PCs set out with immortality as a goal, but Draven's ears sure perked up when it sounded like a possibility. Little One expects to die in battle eventually, and Black seems at least a little on the pious side to seek stuff like that. Woodley asked, "If the party had rope trick to rest in the hideout, how would you have handled the encounter with the zombies?" If the party had hid inside the sanctuary, the zombies would have smashed their way in. The huge ones would have taken a long time, but I figure their gargantuan one has the size and strength to smash into the complex in minutes, like low single-digit minutes. The rope trick might have made it interesting. It would have been annoying as a GM trying to decide whether the Death Knight would think to cast See Invis after the big guy reduced half the hill to rubble. If he did, it would be a desperate encounter with the party either dropping out of the portal to fight, surrounded, or with Floppy reaching in to punch and improved grab them, plucking them out one at a time if they would let him. Whereas, if they hold up in there and the DK didn't think to See Invis, Kaiser would probably have posted the big guy to guard the rubble and gone out searching with the other two, making for a much easier fight where the party would have the initiative. 3C273 asked,
If Elven is like German, and Drow is like Russian, where does Cornello's French come from?
The fantasy French all comes from one source, and it's the same place that a handful of Vistrian NPCs got pseudo-French accents, in a roundabout way. Back in the time of Smith, the land that is now Vistria was ruled by the Frost Giants, and though their language is largely dead in that country, in some regions, the humans who lived near them and dealt with them borrowed words and speech patterns over several generations. Of course, since the sons of Smith and their descendants drove out the giants, the true speakers are relatively few now. But the language persisted among the frost giants who escaped into the north of the Shadowfell, including Cornello's ancient ancestors. Thanks for all your patience with this episode, which took longer than I wanted. Based on the glowing feedback, hopefully most of you feel it was worth it. On the plus side, Demonac.com is starting to fill out. Another gaming comic is coming back, and after reposting the first 200, I've started scheduling daily comics until it's all back up. You can find it at demonac.com/agccomic, and with the redirector script I built, old links to specific comics should come back to life as soon as that comic number is back up. We've got the new fan art page at demonac.com/fanart with a link to email submissions, plus I'll add, in a separate, clearly delineated section, various art I've commissioned, too, like the Swain concept sketches by Tinman. I try to give a rough estimate of when the next episode should come out at demonac.com/latest, and note roughly what stage of production I'm up to. And the map posters are now available, fulfilled by Zazzle.com. You can find the info at demonac.com/map, and of course, Lore Master, $4 plus patrons can download the high-res map on Patreon. For all your support through good times and bad, I can't thank all my Patreon patrons enough.
With a special shout-out to Aether Mordu, Armok G.O.B., Bigrin, Bedimir, Corlin, Carnlin, Duskmar, Divin, Fright Knight, Earl of Sanguine, Get Hype, Fireborn, Greenmute, Gorfiend, Hakun, Havoc, John, Nine, Leocrow, Lonito, Lord Aben, Malice and Death, MG3D, Oldenman, OI1, there's a lot of these guys. Pedrick of Rooney, Pontus, Ramar Ulfist, Repmock, Stan the Man, Starfall, Surf USA, Tempo and June, Skyter97, Toshiro7, Valis, Volkring, Woodley, Warsaw, and Zombie, the members of the organization. Creepy assassin people or something, I don't know.